Thank you, Nate Mann. Dr. Miller. Have we collected some note cards? Okay, if anybody has some note cards, please hold them up and we'll collect
Hold on
them.
just a second.
Don, hang on. I think we're gonna have a little bit of a chat first.
Wonderful.
And we're gonna do that, and we're already mic'd, so
You're
we
mic'd,
have that.
okay.
Thank you, Don.
Thank you.
And thank you, Colonel, for bringing us closer to what it was really like, even closer than what we can do. So thank you so much. Thank you so much for that. Thank you. Nate Mann, who plays Robert Rosie Rosenthal, is on our left, as I'm sure you recognize. And even more recognizable to, I'm sure, many, if not most of you, is Don Miller, the author of Masters of the Air, the founder of our feast. And so please welcome Don Miller, who's such... And I'm Kirk Saduski, as I think Don mentioned, one of the producers of Masters of the Air. I want to say a few things. Just one, before we get into a conversation about the project and the production, I want to mention that all of you connected with the museum should be very happy and very proud of what you've accomplished here. The enormous assistance that we got from the museum, particularly from Scott and Vivian Rogers, was extraordinary. And I know that they were also very, very instrumental. I'll let Don get into that in terms of helping him when he wrote the book. So be very happy, and you should give Scott and Vivian a big hand. And I don't know how many people know this, is fairly new, but I think you'll be excited. That I know that right now being designed and ultimately erected is going to be a monument to the 8th Air Force in Normandy, France. Long overdue. Don was instrumental in kicking that off, and there will be it will be representative of 4 individuals that served in the 8th Air Force. One, of course, is General Doolittle. Another one is Captain Don Blakesley. The other one is Sergeant Maynard Smith, a Medal of Honor winner, who was commemorated in one of the hallways. And the 4th is our own Robert Rosie Rosenthal. So that's being designed. The design is essentially done, but that will be erected within the next year or so in Normandy, in its rightful place because of how crucial the 8th Air Force was to the success of the Normandy invasion. So let's talk a little bit. We definitely want to get to questions, but we want to talk a little bit about the project. I want to ask Don and Nate a few questions. One other thing before we get into that. When the big D symbolizes the 100th Bomb Group. And I think the big D, in a way, I will say, came to symbolize the project for so many of us. I think Nate would agree with me. And the D, in our case, stood for detail, dedication, devotion, and duty. And I think, Nate, I'm going to start with you. Would you agree with that? I mean, there was an extraordinary amount across, and this was an enormous production. The attention to detail and the devotion to getting it right, from your perspective as one of our lead actors. Well, would you agree with that?
I certainly would. They go hand in hand, right? Because when you set out to tell stories like these about men like these going through circumstances like this, and you want to do it justice, otherwise it won't quite feel true, which is really my job. And so the details are what bring it to life. And I would say that one of the reasons that Stephen and Tom have such a history making these kinds of projects is because they care so much about these stories and because they embed themselves in that detail. So stepping into it, right, into these costumes, into these cockpits, all felt like it was there, fulfilling that sense of duty.
Right. Speaking of Steven Spielberg, years ago we were casting for a previous project called The Pacific, which was about the Marines in the Pacific. And one day, as we were casting at the Playtone offices, Steven Spielberg came in, and he was holding up a book. And that book was Masters of the Air. And he said, "I've got the next one." Now, that was premature. We haven't even done the Pacific yet, but he already knew. And cut to several years later, when Playtone, we were approached to do the next project. We knew we had done the Marine Corps, we had done the Army with Easy Company and Band of Brothers, and that left the Air Force, the Navy. We're going to leave the Navy aside for a moment, but with the Air Force. And once we knew almost immediately, because how Stephen introduced us. And we already knew Don from where he helped us with the Pacific a bit. And when we read the book closely, we knew we had exactly our right material. But then this big, huge book, which I'm sure most of you have read, that's about the 8th Air Force. That's just this huge world. So how do you narrow it down? How do you make it transform it into some kind of coherent drama? And it became very apparent to us very early that we had to focus on the 100th Bomb Group. So Don, I want to ask you, you begin your book talking about the 100th Bomb Group, particularly Majors Clevin and Egan, and you conclude your book talking about Major Robert Rosenthal, and you spend a lot of time on the 100th. Tell us why you focus so much on the 100th Bomb Group.
Well, it was primarily because of Rosenthal. I was fishing around for a topic after I finished the Pacific book, and D-Days in the Pacific, and I heard about a conference that was being held down here, and Paul Tibbets was going to be there, and I knew Tibbets from my Pacific book, and I called him up, and he said, "You ought to come, it's going to be really interesting." So I came down, and when I got here, I saw Paul, and he said, "You got a real treat, because there's a guy here named Robert Rosenthal, and you're going to enjoy what he has to say, and I'm going to be proud to introduce him." And he said, "I didn't serve with him. I was a little early, and before I got transferred to North Africa, and then, of course, to the Pacific operations." But that day, Rosie gave a spellbinding talk at the museum, and I met him afterwards. And I've never met, I was talking to Nate about this before, I've never met a more impressive human being in my life. His poise, his coolness, his composure. And I thought you played him to a T in the film. Really, especially in the Munster raid. Rosie loved jazz, so you get the Duke there. But Rosenthal was an amazing guy because I think he personified the entire 8th Air Force. He's a representative, and as is the 100th of the entire 8th Air Force. So Kurt and Tom and I had talked, and they decided to use the 100th as just that. Not the best outfit, not the one that took the most casualties, but the one that was most representative and that had the most interesting to us characters. And this bond, this companionship. I make a statement in my book where you can't fight a war without love. And that seems so contradictory. I'm talking about the kind of compassion and feeling and friendship that human beings in a crew, 10 guys, fight together. We often wondered when we were putting the script together, when I was putting the book together, how the hell did they get in these planes? After experiencing 5 or 6 missions, how do you get back in there? And you see in the film, you just saw a little hesitation on Rosie's part after the Munster mission. And you get in because your buddies got in, and you fought because they fought. And I think, again, that's captured brilliantly in here, this whole idea of love and companionship and feeling that the guys had for one another. And I'm going to swerve a little bit to you again, because I think what makes the film for me is what Kurt talked about. It's a good piece of dramatic filmmaking, no question about it. It's accurate, but the attention to detail is incredible. And the dedication on the part of the actors. They jumped into these roles and they studied them, and they asked questions about them, and they went to boot camp and learned to be a soldier before they were an airman. There was total immersion. When I went to the set in England, I was astonished. I've been involved in several other films before, but I never saw a group of actors so emphatically committed to the project as these guys were. It was really incredible. So there was a nice community of interest between Orloff, who was nuts about the 8th Air Force. I mean, he turned his room up in New York State into an 8th Air Force command headquarters. And he did all this detailed work on these missions, more than I had done on 100, inside the planes, who's flying. You know, he knew everybody inside who was flying the mission in every plane. And he became an historian as well as a brilliant director. And I think if anything, what we try to bring across in the film is the kind of passion that these guys had, especially guys like Rosenthal, and who I got to know. I would visit his house usually once a month. I'd always take a student with me. I wanted the students to see, you know, the kind of men who fought in World War II. And I was particularly impressed with his composure. You know, when you're flying as a pilot in a bomber, you're not like a fighter pilot, one-on-one, mano-a-mano. You got 10 other guys, you got 9 other guys, sometimes 10 other guys that you're responsible for. So when the Air Force looks for pilots, they're looking for guys who can command, who have leadership qualities. And Rosie was this kind of guy who walks in a room and commands the room. And again, I thought you did that brilliantly in an understated way. It would have been so easy to overstate that, you know, and just make him kind of a Steve McQueen kind of character, you know. And instead, we get something a little more muted, a little more controlled, and it was brilliant.
Nate,
Brilliant.
let's explore that with Nate a bit, because you guys and help us understand, and you mentioned it before, but the kind of camaraderie that Don is describing on a B-17 or on an air base like Thorpe Abbott's really was established. I want to say cast and crew, but let's talk about the cast, because you guys became extraordinarily close. You were thrown together, you were in the boot camp, and then you were in England, where I think we shot for about 9 months. Talk about that element of it.
Yeah, that's the kind of thing that turns, you know, that really, that symphony of interest, which is such a good phrase. That's exactly the kind of thing that you know, the stuff behind the scenes, right? Us getting to know one another. You know, a mission like this, you know, this took probably 3 weeks, right, in a replica cockpit on a hydraulic lift, you know, with screens just over and over again. We had 6 cameras going at any given time. And all the while, Josh Bolt, my co-pilot, is sitting right next to me. Every time they call cut, you know, we're getting to, you're right. And this is going on for a year. And that kind of, you know, I was just texting him today, you know, that kind of friendship, right, that I want to say is happenstance, but it's really not. It's actually really the foundation of something like this. Because as Don's saying, that, you know, you're really up there, they're really up there for one another. And, you know, and that kind of extended throughout the whole project. I think because the nature of the show is really the crews, right? There's Rosie's crew, and then there's Egan's crew, there's Buck's crew, all these guys. These are the guys we were filming with, right? And so over the course of the year, you know, they're just, there's a connection there. Yeah.
So you're at the beginning of what we know is going to be a brilliant career, Nate. Yes, exactly. But there's a special, I would imagine, we've talked about this a little bit, there's a special responsibility, I would imagine, when you're portraying not a fictional character, but a real man who accomplished real things and experienced real hardship and sorrow, and has a family still with us, and you've gotten to meet his son and his grandchildren. Talk about that a little bit. What is that like as opposed to playing a campaign manager in a movie?
Yeah. You know, you try to play every character as if they're, you know, a real character, you know, somebody walking in the world, but it's a very different thing when you can go and, you know, in the case of this, you know, shake your character's son's hand. You know, I think it would have been easy maybe to be intimidated or feel a sense of pressure because of that responsibility. But I think because of the nature of this production, and because that responsibility was taken seriously and seen as a way of of doing honor to a specific story, it actually felt very, it made it feel more kind of important and actually more connected to me. I wasn't necessarily intimidated by the fact that I was portraying someone who, who did what he did, and I don't think Rosie thought of himself as a hero, right? None of these guys did.
No.
Right.
And that sitting with that and just realizing that, this is a guy from Brooklyn at the end of the day who was up there in the air just trying to bring himself and his crew back, right? That it's as simple as that.
And the youth, when Ken was talking, what just rang in my head was 19 years old, piloting a plane across the Atlantic to the biggest war in the history of the world. And these guys, as opposed to the other services, never in the history of warfare has so much responsibility been deposited in men so young. There are no generals flying in these planes. Whether they get to the Munster or not, whether they hit the target or not, whether they survive or not, is dependent upon people between the ages of 19 and 24. And I don't think ever in the history of warfare so much responsibility has been put in the hands of kids so briefly trained and inexperienced. Over 40% of the guys who initially flew with the 8th Air Force had never been in an airplane before they started training. And it's just incredible.
I know there's a lot of questions, so we're going to get to that. Before we do that, one last thing, two things I want to say. One is just to reiterate what Don said, because he knew Rosie, and then Nate had to get to know him in a different way so that he could portray him. I read this recently, and I think it strikes me very much, goes to the heart of who Robert Rosenthal was. This is from Heraclitus, the Greek philosopher. Out of every 100 men in combat, 10 shouldn't even be there. 80 are just targets. 9 are real fighters, and we are lucky to have them, for they make the battle. Ah, but then the one. One is a warrior, and he will bring the others back. I think that's who Robert Rosenthal was. And one last thing, and then we'll open up for questions. And we've said this has become something of a mantra for us. At Playtone, this is our third, and Amblin, this is our third project of this kind together. And I think we said this a couple weeks ago in a different venue, but it has become something of a mantra that all of us that are connected in any way with all of these projects, and now particularly Masters of the Air, we get to take the bows, we get the applause, but we all understand it's because of what they did. So we all understand it, and please, we like I said, we definitely understand that. So thank you very much. We know there are a number of questions. Okay, so here we go. Don. Oh, here we go. Okay, Don. Any advice for young historians?
Well, you got to have an iron ass. You got long periods of sitting in front of microfilm and sitting at your desk and talk about getting back to the planes, getting back to your desk in the morning, particularly after a rough night. And yeah, it's commitment. And I'd say don't be afraid to throw yourself into the project. Whole-souled commitment to what you're doing, because you're not going to do it well unless you do. And don't be afraid to take on new subjects. So many historians are writing the same thing their entire life, more and more about less and less. And take on something fresh, something new. A quick story. I did a book on Vicksburg. I knew nothing about Vicksburg when I started. I was down at the Vicksburg battlefield, and I ran into Ed Bars, one of the founders of the Modern Park Service, a guy who's written 6 books on Vicksburg. And Ed was a brilliant guide, and I ran into him by happenstance, and he gave me a tour of the battlefield. We walked around, et cetera, et cetera. And then he said, let's go have a pop. I said, okay, we had a couple of beers. And he said, Miller, you know why you're going to write the best book on Vicksburg? I said, no, I don't, Ed. He said, because you don't know a goddamn thing about it. And it's going to come fresh to you. It's going to be a new project, and you're going to have passion for it. We've been over this road before, and a lot of us get a little jaded and start writing the same thing. And that's what I'd say. And too often you just see people who are staying on one particular project their entire lives. That's good in many cases, but I prefer that they become.
Well, you've in addition to World War II, I think this Masters of the Air was your third book on World War II, I believe.
Yeah, I've written to
But tell us about some of the other subjects that you've tackled.
Well, before I wrote about World War II, I wasn't trained as a military historian. I never took a course with military history in my life, in undergraduate school or graduate school. I was a philosophy major. And my first books were largely about what's called intellectual history, pretentiously, the history of ideas. I wrote a book on New York. I wrote a book on modern Chicago. I was interested in cities, and passionately so. And I just, around 9/11, well, just after, my father died in 1995, and he had served in the Air Force in World War II. And I thought, 6 books under your belt, and you haven't written about your father's service. And so I better know something about World War II first. So I wrote a history of World War II as a way of learning about it, and then eventually worked my way to Masters of the Air, and glad I did.
Well, it's funny that you say that too, because I think it's pretty well known that Steven Spielberg's father was in the Air Force. He served he was a radio operator in the CBI. And Spielberg, and he said it publicly, and he said it very often, that his father was a big fan of Band of Brothers and was a big fan of the Pacific, but went to him, and if I may relay the story, said, "Oh, that's all great, I love all of it, Steve. But what about the Air Force? What about what we did?" So I think we know that was one of the impetuses for us to do Masters of the Air. And again, when he came into our office waving Don's book. Nate, let me ask you, how did playing Robert Rosenthal, how has that affected your life? How has it affected you, obviously as an actor, but also just you individually?
You mean it's working on it and since doing it?
Well, the whole
Yeah,
experience up until this moment. I mean, from when you were first approached to play the role, up until right now.
Yeah. It's funny, things stick around, and when you play a character, especially one for this long and in this much detail, things sort of like stick around with you. It's always a good sign when you keep coming up with questions you might ask of your character. Like I would love to just write and sit down and talk to him about jazz.
Yeah.
And I still feel that, right? I still feel this kind of this curiosity about him, and I think that just comes from when you try and step into somebody's shoes and see the world as they do, you try to explore what they're interested in.
You bring up the jazz, and we mentioned it before, and you saw in the scene, there are other parts of the series where you see Rosie's love for jazz, and it's true. He was Brooklyn, and he used to go to the jazz clubs in Manhattan on 52nd Street, and we mentioned Mittens in one of the legendary jazz clubs in Harlem. But did it help? We discovered, and you mentioned John Orloff earlier, Don. John Orloff was actually our lead writer. And we talked quite a bit about how can we differentiate between these characters. And one of the things we discovered very early on, and talking partially, Don, you knew this and you told us, and talking to the Rosenthal family, is Rosie's love of music. So we incorporated that. Was that helpful? How did that inform how you approached playing Rosie?
What it did, I think that's very astute. What it did is, when I first encountered Rosie, the thing you're struck by is just, the magnitude of what he went through and what he chose to do in spite of what he went through, and that warrior spirit that you're talking about, juxtaposed with this incredible warmth and this grace, and that's where the music lives for me. Is this way, he would sing with his sister and his mom, even though he could, he was a self-professed monotone, right? Like he just had this sense of trying to bring a buoyancy into others' experience, and I think he did with his crew. And that balance there between that steel-headed courage, right, and his kind of effortless warmth with others,
right,
was kind of where I tried to pivot it.
Don was telling us about his father serving in the 8th. You had a relative back from the. Tell us your story. I just learned this when we were in Washington a few weeks ago. Tell us how that helped you prepare when you came across the letter from, I think it was your grandfather.
Yeah,
correct?
yeah. It was my
Tell
grandfather's
us,
letter.
if you don't mind. Tell us
No,
that
yeah, of
story.
course. A couple years ago, it was during the pandemic, and I was, I moved back home with my parents, and I was helping them go through a bunch of boxes that were stuck in the attic. I think a lot of us were doing, spring cleaning because we had all this time. And there was this box of a bunch of my grandfather, my father's stuff, and in it was one that he had sent to his parents in 1941 from University of Virginia, where he had just started being a student, and he was talking about how unhappy he was. And this letter was to them. He's like, I know I've been really off lately. I've gotten here at college. I didn't have a good summer, and I'm sorry that I've been this way. And he was like, I feel this frustration. I feel this sense of wanting to do something with my life, this sense of responsibility to you, to my parents, to my country, and to this society that gives me, a Jew, a chance to live. And that's what he wrote. And in the context of that, this is something I found in 2020, right before I had an audition for this project. And then, when the script came through, just the letter just sort of immediately came back to me, because that personal sense of duty, right, for Rosie was so pivotal to his inspiration in helping him fight, right, and getting through this war, was to defeat, just this, the Nazi regime, right, and having that personal connection, and actually really kind of getting to explore that connection to my grandfather, who had passed at that point, but to his story and to his father's story, was something that it's one of those unexpected kind of great wonders of getting to kind of do the work that we get to do, is overlaying your personal life and going into your world and mapping it onto a story and getting to share it in whatever way you can.
Great, thank you. This next one, Don, I think you're the only one of the three of us who can answer this. Was it possible to fly at an altitude above the flak?
Yeah, the flak is adjusted to the anticipated height that the bombers would come in on from their initial point. So say it's a Liberator outfit, B-24s. They had a thing called a Davis wing, which was very unstable, and Doolittle didn't like to use them in big raids that demanded a lot of height, up to 29,000, 30,000 feet. So you could adjust it. If it's a Liberator group, they're probably coming in at 22,000, et cetera. And that's kind of what you did. And you could have gotten up there, but the bombing would have been abysmally bad.
Right, it would have
And
affected the accuracy.
that was the whole thing. I mean, that's why people often say, well, why didn't they take evasive action? I mean, can you imagine that bombardier sitting there like an eagle about to strike out of the front of the plane, his prey, and there's flak 2 feet, 3 feet in front of you. Shards of steel, really sharp, that can cut through the thin skin of the bomber. And to keep your eyes on the target, it's pretty damn impressive. But LeMay, who initiated these kinds of operations where they wouldn't take evasive action, he said, you're going to get better results of the bombing. You don't have to go back 9, 10 times to hit the target. Well, that was wrong, but it did lead to slightly better accuracy with bombers, but it would have made no sense to go that high. The British who bombed at night went in about 18,000 feet. We went in at 6,000 feet over Tokyo during the fire raids.
Well, and I'm sure most people do know, but let's remind the audience, at what altitude did the 8th Air Force normally bomb?
22,000 feet, 23,000 feet.
Right.
Ken can correct me on that, but that was pretty much a standard mission, yeah.
Well, this is this question is probably fighting words around here. What was a better plane? And you mentioned the B-24. What was a better plane? The B-24, B-17. You even going to dip your toe into that?
Well, The B-24 was a bigger plane. It had more fuel capacity. It had a larger bomb load, and the tremendous capacity, up to 8,000 pounds of bombs. It was, as I said, a little bit unstable. It was very hard. There's a simulator in Norwich, England, at the 2nd Division Museum there, and I flew that B-24. It is like handling, an 18-wheeler on a narrow street. It's an incredibly difficult plane to fly. When I was talking to Tibbets about flying, he said that they flew, not only you have the problem itself with the steering, but he got so close sometimes in their what were called combat boxes that his wings would touch actually the fuselage of the plane next to him. He'd bump into the wing, he'd get jarred backwards. That's how tight the formation was. Is it possible to sweat at 50 degrees below zero? Oh yeah, and one of these bombers. But the B-17, the advantage that it had is it could take a licking and keep flying. It was much more durable than a British Lancaster, which was the bomber that had the most bomb capacity in the war, and was the fastest actually. But the B-17 got back. You saw it brilliantly portrayed, I think, by our directors in his film segment. These planes come back with sometimes 1,000 holes in them, and they made it back. Yeah.
Nate, did you have, looking at the whole experience, from first getting that script and, like I said, until tonight, is there anything that really stands out, again, for you personally in terms of the experience? It could be a personal thing, it could be something that you're proud of, that you accomplished on screen or that we did. Does anything stand out for you in particular?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me it's getting to share it at events like this, right? That, like, being part of, there's other productions, right? But this is unique in that feeling connected to this history and being able to be part of sharing it with you guys and helping to, educate the public on these men, on World War II, on that sacrifice, brings a whole nother dimension of meaning to our work.
Right. Well, that's the other thing people ask all the time. Why World War II? Why World War II? Why are there so many projects, and continues to be? And I think you have to realize that, Don, you mentioned it's the biggest conflict in world history, but I would argue that it's the biggest event in world history. If you take the amount of the globe, which was and the number of people affected worldwide in those 6 years, I can't think of anything that rivals it. There's not really a part of the globe that wasn't affected. And when you consider, I think the latest figure is 65 million fatalities, that's not casualties, that's not displaced persons, that's not people that came home with grievous wounds, grievous physical and emotional and psychological wounds. I think unquestionably it's the largest event in human history. So to be part of that, and why World War II, I think, will continue to be will provide material for drama forever, because again, it's the largest event in human history. Before we wrap up, are there any other questions?
Just one point on that, Kirk.
Yeah, please.
Everybody's looking for unity. We're a divided country today. We were united in World War II. It's one of the magnetic attractions of World War II, the unity of the individual crews, the unity of the country at the time. You lived in World War II inside a world of war. Over 90% of Americans who were gainfully employed over the age of 18 worked in war-related work. And everybody was in it. And the bestiality of the enemy is what drew people together. The desire to smash fascism. And that's a motivating factor. And your country comes first in this case. Country over everything. And defeating the enemy. That's when I asked Rosenthal, for example, why he upped the second time. He said, "You're going to expect me to say because I was Jewish and I had learned about the Holocaust." He said, "I didn't know anything about the Holocaust at the point I re-upped. I did it because I said to myself, as long as Hitler lives, I fly."
Right.
That's the end of the deal.
Yes, in fact, I think it's a good point. Very few, the Holocaust wasn't known. This takes place in, the episode you just saw was October 1943. The Holocaust had begun by then, but it was not widely known, certainly not what we would come to know as the Shoah or the Holocaust. But again, there was, and you're going to see, and I want to remind everyone that this is just one of 9 episodes. Hopefully you've seen the first 4, now you're 5, and we have 4 more to go. And we will get into a little bit more than we've been able to, because right to this point, we've only portrayed, I think we were talking about it earlier, Don, 4 or 5 months in these guys' experience. We have a couple of years left in the war, in our series. So, and more of the context of what these men had to endure and achieve, what they had to endure and what they achieved is coming up. So please stay tuned every week, and we thank you very much.
Kirk, Don, Nate, thank you for an extraordinary evening, a memorable evening, and for this epic production. We're grateful. And Don, for starting all this craze with the book and doing much of your work in the archives here of this museum. So thank you.
I'm glad you brought that up, Scott. I keep saying one last thing, and I keep adding to the list, but I promise. You're going to find out on a day after tomorrow, if you pick up the New York Times, number 7 on the New York Times bestseller list is Masters of the Air. Now,
And we have a podcast.
Someone
Tune into that.
Someone, and check me on this, but I believe that's unprecedented for a book that was published 20 years ago to climb onto the New York Times bestseller list. So, congratulations, Tom.
Thank you. It's been a long evening. I know some of you would stay here for hours. Some would like to go. We're going to let you go in just a minute. But the military has a long tradition of rewarding exceptional service with what is called a challenge coin. And more recently, in addition to recognizing and rewarding exceptional service, challenge coins are used as expressions of respect and gratitude, and also as a way of building bonds between brothers, comrades in service, as you all talked about 10 men coming together as a crew and working and going up day after day knowing that it might be their last breath, but they did it nonetheless. We're going to present 3 challenge coins tonight, and our presenters are 3 young summer campers here at the museum. I'd ask that Finn Summerall, Finn, if you would come up, Charles Lapp, and Caden Devesky. I think I got that wrong, Caden, I apologize. So guys, come on up here. We're going to put Finn right here. How about right here, Charles? And Caden, how about right here, buddy? Okay, right there. All right. And now we're gonna bring up our 3. So how old are you, Finn? 14. Charles? 12. Caden? 13. That's 39, I think, right? 39 years collectively here. Bruce Cook, Bruce, please. Bruce is the baby of the World War II veterans at 98. All right, Bruce. Gordon, Savannah resident. Gordon is 100. He'll be 101 next month. And the old guy, Ken Beckman. Ken, my traveling buddy, come on.
Ken is 101, as he said earlier. He'll be 102 in August. So 101, 100, we're at 299 years here
Wow.
versus 39, okay? And at this time, Caden, turn to Ken. Charles, turn to Gordon. Bruce, turn to Finn. And young guys, present on behalf of all of us, these three young guys are presenting challenge coins to show our respect and gratitude to these warriors and these gentlemen who were willing to sacrifice everything for the freedoms we enjoy today. Present those coins if you would, please. Thank you for being with us. That concludes our program. Thank you very much.